Hello, I'm Kyle Hess. My subject was what is the definition of news? And I strove to break down that question of what is the definition of news into content driven versus authority and media outlets. What this essentially means is news determined by what's in it, such as politics versus entertainment features, or is it determined by who's announcing it and who's making it? Charles N. Fisher of Louisiana State University broke down the definition of news as to a three-part working definition. Webster's dictionary definition is a report of recent events. Well, in the news media, this doesn't really work. Charles said that there's three parts. One is what people want to know. People want to know what is entertaining to them and what is exciting to them. This includes, famous people activities, and it doesn't matter how mundane. As long as people talk about it after they read it, it's considered news, which, of course, as we'll get to, is a very flawed opinion. But it further goes down to say that news is what people need to know. This focuses more on the politics, the national events, so on and so forth. Things that we traditionally think of, well, journalists should cover this. This is what news should be. And then, of course, he says that news is a money-making proposition. Now, this isn't so much the sense of capitalism that has depreciated the quality of news, but instead he says it's focusing more on the economic side, that money-making proposition is just how the business continues on. It's not the means of depreciation in quality that people commonly attribute it to. He says that's kind of a layman's mistake in not really taking a look at the actual definition, because the buyer has to be satisfied. If the audience doesn't like what they're reading, they're not going to buy it. So what he is suggesting is that the money-making aspect is not so strong as people believe it to be. Tom Bettig of Harvard International Journal in Press and Politics explained in his article The Evolution of News that might not be quite right. When he first started off in the industry, they said that news is what I say it is. Well, now he was talking about his professors and fellow colleague writers who take a lot of pride in their training and experience and the fact that they know what is news, they know what the public needs to know, and as such makes them the authority because they know what we need, they know what we want. And these strict standards of excellence and ethics is what was reflected in their articles, which we consider to be, quality journalism. But what happened is that as journalism became more and more prominent in making or driving social changes, is that journalists were began to see as celebrities of sorts, which we can see nowadays, where Rush Limbaugh is not so much a journalist as he is an opinion leader, who a lot of people believe is to be somewhat overly glorified. You don't watch Rush Limbaugh to watch the news. You watch Rush to watch Rush. So there's a slight depreciation in that value. Earlier on, it was noted that journalism had a lack of a scientific approach, which is, well, how do you know what people know? How do you know that people actually like or care what you're writing about? So they began to use polls and research questions, focus groups, so on and so forth, which to determine what the people wanted to read and hear about. Of course, use of these tools became fairly widespread, and pretty soon every publication had their own research department, which was resisted by most journalists because they felt it was stifling not only to their creative process, but they felt that this was going to depreciate journalism, and in a way they were right. All of a sudden, news became what the audience, want to know. Of course, news eventually became capitalized. Corporations began to buy most media outlets, and they began to focus on what sells. News is what makes money. This includes cheaper operations, which we see the gutting of the newsrooms, the cutting out of the middleman in order to relay news in the cheapest way possible, which began to further increase the decline of quality. Eventually, they began removing the journalistic filter, which is the mindset of writers who say, well, this is important, this is what we need, to just covering live events. News is anything you can get a camera to. And the constant demand of content further drives the depreciation in quality. News is content for the pipeline nowadays, because since people want media, and they want the information and they want it nonstop, there's a constant demand for it, it puts a lot of pressure on journalists to keep returning and producing more articles, more information, so on and so forth. So they begin to dive in the smallest of things, further going into, well, we're going to dig into this celebrity's life and, find out that, Nicki Minaj ate a taco. Let's write that. Which, of course, we laugh at that notion because it's ridiculous. How is that news? But they're constantly producing for a pipeline, which is what news has been reduced to. And it drives news to be more like entertainment, which, as we all say, well, news isn't what it used to be, but that's because the focus of news has changed. Scherer from the Institute of Journalism and Com Research of Hanover and Trepp from the University of Hamburg did an interesting research piece on opinion leaders and dividing them into two topics, experts and dazzlers. Now, they did a lot of theory and research focusing on the interpersonal communications and their influence of media effects. And they said that people talking to each other in and out about the news was more influential than the actual news itself. Of course, they're focusing more on opinion leaders in the community, such as your local politics, mayor, different leads of boards, so on and so forth, even clergymen, pastors, and so on and so forth. And they focused a little bit on the original two-step flow of communication, which is the information flowing from the media to opinion leaders and from them to less active sections of the populace. I'll get back to that in a short moment. They further go on to say that, of course, the two-step flow of communication is somewhat outdated. It's been revolved to the multi-step because media is first transmitted to everyone, and the interpersonal communications through opinion leaders and otherwise are just more supplementary to the data information, and then secondly, more important on special interest and critical thinking. They go on to talk about the different scales used to determine opinion leadership, and they break everything down into, as I said before, informed opinion leaders and dazzlers. And they said that informed opinion leaders prefer to use facts and just relay facts and information, whereas dazzlers work on reasoning, which you'll see if you were to ever watch MSNBC or Fox News, how they don't rely strictly on the facts. They go on to explain more how they feel, why they feel, and people take that and it influences them. So, in conclusion, breaking this all down, originally I had asked, is news content-driven or is it assumed by the authorities? And well, this is a loaded question because content, of course, is determined by the authorities. The journalists decide what gets published and what they write, so on and so forth. But the ethics and standards that are reflected in the content, that's what we judge news to be. We see that the lack of ethics and the lack of these qualities diminishes the value of the news. So, as I said, it's a loaded question, but going back to the less active members of society, people either take whatever's handed to them or they apply critical thinking, and that causes two major sections of the audience to be divided. So you have your journalists who focus more on hitting the hard news, and then you have your your journalists who focus on more entertainment based, just so they can churn out ratings, so on and so forth. In conclusion, it's decided that journalism is the definition of news really can only be determined by the idea that it's constantly changing based upon the needs and wants of the public. So it's just this endless cycle, the snake eating its own tail, which, as I will look to break down furthermore in my actual official paper. Thank you very much for watching.